So, welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. This is a monthly initiative done by the Faith and Spirituality Center every first Wednesday of the month, in which we invite students, staff, and other folks to talk about their journey, spiritual or none. Today we have Makayla Freeman, who is a student, a participant in the center's Kaleidoscope program around 2 years ago, and a good friend of the center. And she's here to talk about empowerment, women empowerment specifically in faith circles and spaces. So we'll give the floor to her now.
Hi. Like Simon said, my name is Makayla. I'm a student here at the University of Calgary. I'm doing my psych degree. And I'm also working here at the Faith and Spirituality Center. I come in on Mondays and do things other people don't have time to do. It's really fun. It gives me an excuse to hang out here more often. I'm going to be referring to my laptop, not because I want it to be like a barrier between me and all of you listeners, but because I need notes to keep me on track, because there's a million and one things I could say. So that's what I'm going to do. I also want to start by saying that I'm going to be sharing my story with all of you, and that my experiences are my own, not necessarily representative of anyone else's from my faith community. And so there may be pieces of my story in which I talk about communities that were not helpful for me, but that doesn't mean that they're not helpful or life-giving for other people. Although I'm more than happy to answer any questions about those things afterwards. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my journey with faith community and with spirituality. And then I'm going to share a little bit at the end about kind of what that has looked like in a space of intersecting identity for me, which is being both a person of faith and also being a woman, using she, her pronouns, all of those things, and what that's looked like in my journey. I'm going to be reading a couple pieces of poetry as I share, not things that I've written, but things that I think put into words better than my own, some of the things that I want to share with you all today. Does that sound okay?
Sounds lovely.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So my story kind of starts when I was born, because I was born into a community of faith. I was born in Lloydminster. Has anyone ever heard of Lloydminster before? Yeah. It's on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's about the same size as Airdrie. It's like a weird mix between a farm community and an oil town. It's a really funky place. It was interesting to grow up there, but it's small, has very much like a small town mentality, has a lot of churches. So I grew up in one of the churches in the town. It was about 50 to 60 people on a good Sunday, usually more like 20 to 30 people who'd come. My dad was a pastor there, so he started pastoring in the church when he was 17. He was put in charge of the youth ministry and organized all of the youth events. And my mom got married to him. She lived in Calgary when she was 18 and moved to Lloyd, and she is a singer. She has a beautiful voice. And so she took over what they call the worship ministry at the church. So every time there'd be a service, my mom was the person who would stand at the front of the room and sing songs. The church sang a lot of contemporary worship music. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to Tehillah Monday before or something similar. So yeah, it's a lot like that. Would have been like the worship that I grew up with. And the church that I went to is part of a denomination of Christianity, so a branch of Christian practice called Word of Faith, which is evangelical in the sense that the purpose of the Christian life, as defined by this community, is to tell other people about Jesus. And so I grew up believing that my mandate as a Christian was to go and tell as many people as possible who I believe Jesus was, and to invite them to be a part of that. What that looked like was me being like 6 years old, and my grandma was like a hardcore evangelist, which meant she like spent all of her free time door knocking and going to malls and going and inviting people to church. And we had these things called tracts, which are like cartoon versions of the story of Jesus. And I was like 6 years old, and she would take me to the mall, and I would go from table to table in the food court, being like, this is who Jesus is, and trying to get people to come to church with me. So that was kind of what that looked like. It's also kind of like a Pentecostal community in the sense that it's also like Tehillah Monday in that sense. What that means is that the expression of worship was something that was very outwardly expressive. And so during music in the service, that looked like people raising their hands, jumping up and down, closing their eyes and crying. It also meant there was an invitation at the end of every service for people to come up to the front. So the stage where the pastor would preach is called an altar, and people would be invited there to have the pastor put hands on their shoulders or on their head and pray for them for healing or for peace. And so it was a very lively church environment. There was also a really high commitment required by this community. Because my parents were in leadership, and because some of, I would say, the more like toxic parts of this community, there was pretty strict boundaries on who was in and who was out. So that meant that I wasn't allowed to have friends who didn't go to my church. You weren't allowed to date people who were from other churches. You weren't allowed to go to events at other churches. And so I had a very kind of firm idea of this church understood the Bible. They knew how to interpret it. The pastor knew exactly what it meant. And anyone who said otherwise was a bad Christian. And anyone who didn't believe in the Bible at all needed saving. And so it was my job to just like go out and find people and save them and bring them to my church. So this was my experience growing up in church. I was there until I was 11. I was there 2 times a week at minimum, if not 5 days a week. We had someone in from out of town. And then we moved to Calgary. And when I moved here, I went to a non-denominational school. It was a Christian school, and that was a big change for me. So I went from believing that there was one way to understand the Bible, one way to be a Christian, and everyone else had it wrong, to being in school with a bunch of people who were like, hey, I'm a Christian, but I understand the Bible this way, or I see God this way, or my church does things like this. And that blew my mind. I thought there was Christian that looked like this, and then there was non-Christian, which needed help. And then it was like, Christian can look like a lot of different things. And so that was actually a really a big learning season for me, in the sense that I went through the process of having to understand what I thought it meant to be Christian. Because I was like, I can be a Christian and it can look like this, or it can look like this, or it can look like this, and I have to really parse out what it is that I believe. And so while I was there, I was pretty heavily involved. I became one of the student leaders. And so I preached in chapel often during the weekly services. So I would like teach out of the Bible to the kids I went to school with. I played worship, so I played bass guitar and played piano, and led worship almost every week with those kids. And I think I learned 2 things from that experience. One, like I already said, that there's more than one way to be Christian, and that was new for me. But I also had the experience of feeling like we talked a lot within that community about other groups of people that we didn't know or understand. So for example, in one of our classes, we learned about all the different religions, but all of the people talking about it were all Christian, and no one had any experience with any of these other belief systems. And so I remember feeling a little bit like I was getting one side of every story. Like I was supposed to walk out of school believing that I understood the whole world, but I didn't know a single person in Calgary who wasn't a Christian. And so I was like, well, can I say that I really understand? My dad also, I think I said, became a pastor at a church here in Calgary. And so I grew up as a pastor's kid, and that continued into my teens. I became the youth leader at my church, so I ran all the youth programming, and I was on stage every Sunday for church. So pretty involved. And when I graduated high school, I was like, okay, this is my time. I'm gonna go to the University of Calgary, and I'm gonna meet a bunch of non-Christians, and I'm gonna save them all. Was kind of my idea when I started going to school here. So I took as many classes in my first semester as I could that presented perspectives that were different than mine. So I took like a philosophy class on love, sex, and death, which my parents were super excited about. Not really at all. I took a religious studies class on religion and the good life, and learning what other traditions thought a good life was. And the reason why I did this was because I was like, if I'm going to convince other people that I'm right, then I need to know their side of the story better than I know mine. So it was like, how can I have a conversation with someone and tell them that I know the truth if I haven't first thought through what their perspective might be and like know how to break it down. So that was my plan. That is not what happened. What ended up happening was I started to realize that the world as I thought of it was not an evil place. I met people who were not religious or people who came from other faith backgrounds, and they were generous and they were kind, and they weren't coming to me being like, I need what you have. They were actually really content and thriving. And this like challenged my whole idea of what people needed from me. The other thing that I learned was there were a lot of perspectives I'd never thought of, a lot of ways of thinking about things or understanding things that I'd never considered, new ideas and well thought out perspectives that I'd never heard of before. But I'd say probably what was the most striking for me about that experience was hearing stories that were heartbreaking that I'd never heard before. Stories about things like racism, about things like homophobia, about things like sexism and violence, systemic oppression, all of these big words that we hear probably a lot on campus that I'd never heard of before. And I think the most heartbreaking part of that for me was learning, not only was it sad that I'd never heard of these things because of my own privilege, but also that the church had been a part of a lot of these stories in ways that I'd never been taught. And so this kind of moved me to feel a responsibility to do something with this now. I was like, there are all of these stories that I haven't heard, that I haven't listened to, all of these people who are kind and generous that I never expected to meet. What does that make me, and who does that make me in all of this? There's a few other things that happened kind of in this season of I guess what I would say happened in that season for me was an unraveling of my faith. I started to look at things that I thought I knew were true, things I thought all the way through, and realized that I hadn't. Realized that there were perspectives different than mine. Realized that some of the stories that I believed left people out who were important to me. And so I started to ask a lot of really hard questions of my faith and my faith community. And I would say something that made that particularly challenging for me was being a pastor's kid and being the person who was expected to set the example, being the one who was leading. It was like I really only had 6 days to have a faith crisis because by Sunday I needed to be back up on the stage preaching again, or I needed to be back up on the stage worshiping very publicly, and I couldn't be standing up there with doubts and questions. And so it kind of put me in this very awkward position of like having all of these questions and being really unsure, and then having to like pull myself back together every Sunday to go up and lead. Something else that kind of happened in that season of my life was that my family went through a really difficult season of personal crisis, and I think being raised where my family and church and my idea of God were so intertwined, when something was awry in one of those areas, it was like all of a sudden church didn't make sense and God didn't make sense to me because they were all the same thing. And the process of like making church and family separate, or making church and God separate things, because I was seeing, kind of the backstage view of some of the dysfunction, some of the human aspects of church, of people getting hurt and people doing things for the wrong reasons and all that stuff, and being like, maybe church isn't what I thought it was. And then I also participated in Kaleidoscope Project here, which was amazing, but also blew my mind because I was like, I had thought I had learned everything there was to learn, and then all of a sudden there were all of these new things, and this beautiful community of people who all thought differently and believed differently. It was life-giving and felt like home in a way that church used to for me. And so it meant that I ended up kind of opening my hands with my beliefs and being like, okay, I need to reevaluate all of these things. And kind of like my motto, I guess you could say, at that time, was the idea that if truth is truth, if there is some sort of truth that is objectively true, that I'm not responsible to protect or to maintain or to convince other people of, then it's okay if I ask questions of it. Because in the same way that we do like scientific method, for example, where we believe that we're trying to discover something that's already happening in the world, so if we ask really rigorous questions, then we'll see the evidence of that. I started to feel that way with faith, where I was like, I can ask really rigorous questions of truth, and I'll just be discovering more of it rather than dissolving it or disentangling it in some way. So last year I had the opportunity to travel abroad to Sweden, which is a largely not religious country. There were no churches in the city that I went to that spoke English, which I was like, I don't have to go to church because there's no one here. I don't understand Swedish. Gave me a good excuse to tell my parents I wasn't going to church for a while. And it was the first time in my whole entire life, in like 20 years, that I'd gone more than one Sunday not in a church service. And it kind of gave me permission to do that untangling that I talked about, where I didn't only have a 6-day time limit to ask questions. I didn't have to pull myself back together for anyone else. Kind of had the freedom to explore. And so when I came back after that season, I made the decision to step out of leadership and to stop attending my parents' church when I got back, which is something that they very graciously held space for. My parents, I think that was really hard for them to give me permission almost, or to be okay with me saying I'm not going to lead in your church anymore. But they were willing to say, okay, we can't convince you of anything, you're an adult and we love you anyways and we want this to be your journey. So I haven't attended church since I've been back, and I think what I've discovered in that space in between is that spirituality is still something that's important to me, still something that feels at home to me, but that I've needed to explore other ways of connecting to it that maybe don't have some of the baggage or the complications or the like weird family dynamics of church as I've known it to this point. So I would say that I still, in many ways, identify with the label Christian and still find that the stories of the Bible resonate with me in some way and feel important. I would say that there are certain ideas like justice and mercy and redemption that I think to me are inherent to my, or come from my experiences in church and in church community. And I think they'll always be that way, even as maybe my understanding of who God is or how I relate to the Bible changes. And I think I've found other spaces that feel more at home to me in this season. One of those being Arise, which is a meeting that we do on Fridays that's much more open. It's less like someone preaching at you and more like a space to hold questions or hold a poem or hold an idea. And if you want to invite God into that moment. And that's been really healing for me. I wanted to read a poem that I think kind of summarizes the way that I relate to faith in the current season. It's called The Great Homesickness. It's an old poem, but I was exposed to it from a song rendition of it done by a band that I've followed for a long time. But I'll just read it. I'm going to read it really slowly, so feel free if you'd like to close your eyes or look down to hear it clearly. You're welcome to. The Great Homesickness. Oh, how I love you, gentlest of waves, who ripens us as we wrestle with you. On the day that you made us, you created yourself, and we grew sturdy in your sunlight. The great homesickness we could never shake off, the forest that always surrounded us. You, the song that we sang within every silence, the dark net threading through. I love you. So I think this kind of idea of faith being a longing for home, or a desire for some sort of connection to this home all around us, I think is the way that I relate to faith. Language around faith being an invitation to a table for everyone, of it being a space where all can come and eat until they're full, where they can laugh and love and be in community with one another. This understanding of a faith that's ever growing, that's ever inviting, that's holding space for all people, is probably the idea of faith that I'm most comfortable with in the current season. So that's a little bit of kind of my story when it comes to how I've navigated faith spaces and where I've come from. And I don't think it's a finished story. I'm very comfortable saying that I'm kind of in the middle of figuring a lot of things out. And I'll probably tell this story in a very different way if you were to ask me in 5 years. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes, just a little bit about, I know Simon talked about this idea of like female empowerment or what it looks like to be woman or she, her in a faith space. And I think that's been a big part of my journey as well. And it's also been something that I've been navigating and sorting through and figuring out a lot in the last couple of years. So I would say the faith spaces that I've been in have been fairly patriarchal, which I don't know if that's surprising to anyone. But the idea of there being a particular kind of way that women are supposed to exist in the world, that there's a particular story of a good woman's life that looks a lot like being a good catch for some husband out there, of being a supportive and dedicated and godly wife, of raising kids that love God, and of that kind of being your purpose is to serve and to support a man, is kind of the idea of womanhood that I was handed, that I was taught, this idea that I existed for the purpose of propping someone else up, of nurturing someone else, and that was my call. And for a lot of reasons, that narrative has grown, I think, increasingly uncomfortable for me in the last couple of years. There's a lot of ways that story feels really narrow, and like it doesn't quite fit how I understand myself and how I exist as a woman in the world. But I also feel like there's a lot of beauty in the idea of a caring and loving God or divine, of compassion, softness, and of mothering from a divine being that I can also embrace even as a woman. I think I felt in many ways that I could be a person of faith and be true to that, or I could be a woman as I understand that and identify with that, but that those two pieces of myself couldn't exist whole in one space. And so there's been a work of reclaiming that for me in the last couple of years. So I wanted to read an excerpt from a spoken word piece that I think depicts this story well. And then I wanted to open it up for discussion and talk for a long time. But this piece is from a spoken word piece called Moment One by Lisa Gungor. Has anyone ever heard of Gungor or the Liturgists? Is that familiar? Yeah. So Lisa is a musician. She wrote this spoken word piece, and it's long. It's beautiful. You can find it on YouTube. It's like 10 minutes. But I just wanted to pull two pieces from it to give some context of where we are in the poem. She's talked about what it was like being born into a female body, about being a child and feeling free and proud and excited and curious about her own skin, and then learning at some point, I think she talks about when she was 6, learning that her body was something to be ashamed of, and that this is a story she learned from other adults in her life, but also from her church community. And so I'm picking up the story where she's talking about being 14 and sharing a little bit of her question about her body in relation to faith. And then I'm jumping to the end where she kind of talks about the empowerment piece, or where she's landed with it. She says, now that I am 14, now that I am changing, is God now ashamed with what he made? The body formed in my mother, so good and beautiful, turned to shame with age, and religious threads weaving and constructing my social identity. Oppression for something I cannot control, something completely natural and good. If this body is not holy in and of itself, then God should have never made it in the first place. It's the flower hating its vibrant petals, the beautiful tree sprouting from the earth only to grow and be ashamed of its bark. She is not shame. She is beautiful woman with beautiful body, capable of cosmic realities, holding someone close, experiencing love, making love, creating life, accepting another human life as her own, feeling pain, joy, giving strength, healing with a kiss, wholeness with a touch, giving physical and mental nourishment with her own body. She is grounded enough to follow, still capable to lead from a child to a nation. The woman's body is made in the image of love, from love herself, life herself, so she herself is of God. For my grandmother, for my mother, for my daughters, my friends, and as a reminder to myself, be proud, beautiful woman. Your body is intrinsically good, perfectly good. Perfect from moment one. So I wanted to open up this space. Firstly, I think, I'm gonna check the time. We have about 20 minutes. So I wanted to first open it if anyone had any questions. I'm more than happy to share more, answer questions we have. But I also wanted to open up this space. I shared a little bit about the idea of existing in spaces of faith with another part of identity, with being female. And I'm curious if other people want at this point to share some of their story of maybe being a person of faith and some other part of identity and what that's been like for them. I'd love to hear from and learn from your story, but only as you feel comfortable. So people are welcome to ask and share what they wish. Yeah.